finished the mark making on my face. One thing that I made sure to do with my hatching is to be very conscious of the direction I was going and sometimes changing it up depending on what part of my face I was working on. And before, I had the faintest outline where the edge of my shadows were. I didn't necessarily outline that with ink. I just cross-hatched until I got to the edge of that line. So I can go in and erase any of those little extra lines that were kind of my guidelines later or earlier. And I'm ready to move on to watercolor. So I taped down my project because my paper will probably warp and buckle, making it hard to paint on and making it so that there are more indented areas for the watercolors to pool and it will dry unevenly. So I have to work on color mixing. So I have all of my supplies, I have my project, I have paintbrushes, I have my paints, I have a paper towel, I have a water cup. And in order to mix the color you want, you need to get your paintbrush wet, and watercolor brushes are very absorbent compared to other paintbrushes. They will absorb and take in that water very quickly. And in order to wet an area, you just take your wet brush and rub it across that dried up watercolor paint and make a puddle of it over here. The longer you scrub at your watercolors, the more pigment it picks up and can move somewhere else. And I just kind of press the edge of my paintbrush against some kind of ridge so that it squeezes some of that extra water out for my puddle. And I'm going to work on the background first. There's a lot of background, so I'm going to need to make more paint than I think I need. I'm going to make a big puddle right here. And one thing I do before actually painting on my paper is sometimes I test it off on a different piece of paper to see if that's the color I truly want, instead of jumping right in and finding out that I made a mistake. So if I want to work on color blending, there's a couple things I can do, but I'm going to go over the do's and don'ts real quick. So one thing you do want to do is work systematically from one area to the other. I don't want to paint unevenly or it will dry unevenly. So I think I'm going to paint from top to bottom. So I need to start up here and evenly bring my paintbrush strokes across until I make my way down, not leaving any spots unpainted to go over later. I do want to build up my layers slowly. So if I go in too dark right away, usually that's not a good thing to do. I do want to give my paints the proper wait time. So if I paint the background, I don't want to go and paint an area that is right next to it. And that gets into my don'ts. So you don't want to paint two colors next to each other while they're still wet. If my background is purple and I paint my dark brown hair next, if those two colors are both still wet, they will bleed into each other. And that's not the look I'm going for with this project. I don't want to paint directly from my paint onto my paper. I need to make a puddle first. Do not scrub at your paint on your paint palette and directly go to your paper. That will pick up too much pigment and it probably won't be the color you want right away. You don't want to use too little paint. Like, more water is better, because if your paintbrush dries out too much too quickly and you have to remix that color, that's usually not a good thing to do. You want to not use too little pigment. And you need to know that watercolors dry a little lighter than you think. So if this looks like a dark color and I think I went a little too dark, know that once it dries, it will be much lighter. So I mixed this purple right here by mixing a reddish color, like a reddish pinkish color, with blue. And one thing that I had to do, because it seemed too bright, is I needed to mute it down a little bit. So I can do that by mixing a earth tone, like a brown or a yellow ochre or a black. I can also mute down this purple by looking at a color wheel and mixing the color that is its complement, or the color that is exactly opposite this purple on the color wheel, which is yellow. So I could go in with yellow and make this a little bit more muted down and less bright and saturated. So working on my paper, Couple different ways we can do this. One painting technique is wet on wet, and that means I wet my paper first with a paintbrush, and then I add my watercolor afterwards. This is good for making even tones. This is good for making light colors on your painting. You want to be very careful not to paint outside the lines when you do this, though. Otherwise, it will bleed into areas of your painting you don't want it. So instead of accidentally painting this water onto my hair, I'd rather make the mistake of not painting close enough to my hair. That's a better way to go than over painting that water. And you'll have to remember, kind of make a mental map of where you have already wetted down. Again, starting systematically from one side and moving to another side is best. But another way of checking to see if you successfully did wet on wet here is taking a look at your painting from multiple viewpoints and seeing how that light reflects off of that surface. It's going to be a little bit shiny where you see you've already painted water. So wet on wet is ready to go. I'm going to go in with my purple, and I'm going to systematically start up here and make my way downward. So that's the beginning of my wet on wet. I'm gonna switch colors and show you color blending. So I wipe off my paintbrush, and I tilted my paper just a little bit so that the color starts kind of blending downward a little bit, and it works a little bit in my favor here. But I'm going to switch to this pink color because I want to start blending it into pink. So one way to color blend, and it's easier to do if you do wet on wet because that paper is already very wet. But color blending works best if both colors are wet at the same time. So I'm just painting the pink underneath it while the purple is still wet. I'm tilting my paper just a little bit because it's going to help me out. Color blending doesn't have to work only with wet on wet. Color blending also works without wetting that paper first. So that's coloring or color blending. That is also wet on wet. Now, if you make a mistake painting, you can fix up those areas, and I can show you how right now. If you accidentally paint outside the lines of somewhere you don't want, this is not going to be too much of a problem for me because I will be painting brown over that later, and that purple is too light to make much of a difference. But you can go in with either a dry paper towel and blot that up while it's still wet, or if it's already had too much time to dry, you can go in with a wet but clean paintbrush and scrub at that area. The more you scrub, the more likely it can pick up that pigment. Negative of that is if you scrub too hard, you distress that paper, and it'll be harder to work with in that area later. I'm just gonna kind of blot that dry. That lifted off that watercolor pretty nicely. And I'm going to let my background dry, and I might babysit it a little bit because it might look fine now, but it might dry unevenly. So I can maybe hold it upright so it dries kind of at an angle so it doesn't pool in any of those areas that might be buckling. Or I could just leave it like this and keep an eye on any areas that are drying in a way that I don't want them to. So my background has dried a little bit. I'm still gonna go in and paint an area that is not directly touching that background. So I'm gonna go in with the face. I need to mix a good skin tone for that. So I'm going to have to clean up this puddle and get going on that skin color. My background has had some time to dry, but it's still a little too wet for comfort when I touch it. So I'm going to paint another area that's not directly touching that background color, so my face. I cleaned up my paints here and I'm ready to mix a skin color. One thing about these paints is if you don't get around to finishing your whole painting all at once, you can let it dry and re-wet that puddle later. So a good combination of colors to mix for skin tones is using yellow. Now I have a little bit of yellow ochre here. If you don't have yellow ochre, regular yellow is fine. A little bit of brown and a little bit of red. And test that color out first before painting it right on your face, because it may not be the color you want it to be. You might need to end up going in with more red or more yellow. And I'm gonna have to water it down a lot too. So everybody's skin is just a different color. So whatever pigment you mix, you'll have to kind of decide just how much of those colors you can use. Theoretically, if you mix all of the primary colors together, red, yellow, and blue, it should get you a skin color, but I find it's easier to do brown, red, and yellow. So I'm gonna go in and paint my face. I'm gonna do a little bit more wet on wet for that. And I need to make sure not to paint over my eyeballs, not to paint over other areas like my hair, which is another reason why wet on wet is so good for this. I'm gonna paint right over my lips though. You don't want to leave your lips looking not like a skin color. I can show you how to make it look a little bit more pink later. But wet on wet's a good way to start here. I think I'm going to paint right over my glasses just because I know my glasses are black and I can easily cover up that skin color that I paint later. It's easier than trying to paint around my glasses. And I'm gonna go in with my skin color. So one thing I want to do, a little bit more red. So one thing I want to do with this is I really want to preserve some of the white of my paper because it's hard to go backwards with watercolors. It's hard to lighten up those areas. It's easy to darken up those areas later. So I might want to leave some patches here or there without color, but that hard line is not very realistic. So I can go in with a different paintbrush that is wet but clean and kind of pick that up. Just kind of soften that edge. That's one thing I do when I try to introduce shadows or something and the edge of that shadow is just too sharp or harsh. I go in and just kind of soften the edge with a different paintbrush, and I still have that color or that value blend look where it goes from my regular color to that white. Another technique for that is using a different paper towel and pressing it onto your paper, and that's called lift off. So wherever I see an area that could be lighter that I went a little overboard with my watercolors with, I want to work quickly and pick up that pigment with another paper towel. I have to do it while it's still wet. This will not work later. if it's already dried. And again, I end up with really sharp edges. If that doesn't bug me, I can leave it. It always dries to look just a little different than you're expecting. Or I could go in with a wet but clean paintbrush to soften the edges of those areas so that it's not as sharp, looks a little bit more natural. Now I want to make it so that my face isn't all just one solid pale color. I'm going to want to introduce some pinks in there, here or there, depending on what you see in your picture reference. So I'm going to end up mix a little bit more pink with that same skin color. I'm using that same skin color, but added a little bit more of that red or pink. And if I want to subtly add maybe some blushy colors to the cheeks or nose, I want to work while the rest of the skin color is still wet. And I just drop that down in that area. It should blend on its own if you leave it. Now this looks really dark, and it kind of is, but when it dries, it's not going to be as bright pink as you think it is. It might kind of go through like a clown phase where it looks like I'm wearing stage makeup, but it always dries a little lighter, and I want to kind of keep an eye out on that. So I'm going to paint maybe some pink on my nose, where my cheeks are, and let the water do the blending for me. And if it's drying to be a little too light, like in this area that at first I was worried looked too dark, I can drop more pink down. But it has to happen while it's still wet. Do not go in and make your lips pink at this point, because I made my cheeks pink. It's blending all on its own, which is what I want it to do. I don't want the pink on my lips to blend, or it's gonna look like I have some kind of clown makeup that got rained on and it's gonna blend all over, and that's not kind of the realistic look that is in my picture reference.